At 6 p.m. on Friday, December 17, 2010, a 25-year-old woman named Jo Yates sat drinking and listening to Christmas music at the Bristol Ram pub with some of her co-workers in Bristol, England. Jo, who was a landscape architect, and her co-workers were regulars at this pub. But tonight, they were there specifically to celebrate an early Christmas together. Jo sipped her cider and looked out the window at the falling snow. The sun had just set, and the snowflakes seemed to glow under the streetlights. This, along with the holiday decorations on the shops outside, made the whole street look like the cover of a Christmas card. Jo looked away from the window and joined in on the conversation with her coworkers, who were talking about their various holiday plans. Jo said she was very excited because this was the first Christmas she was going to spend with her boyfriend, Greg Reardon. Greg had gone on a weekend trip, but when he got back, they were going to spend a week with their family and then travel, just the two of them, to Scotland for Hogmanay, which is like a Scottish New Year's celebration. As Jo spoke about Greg, she couldn't help but smile. A few years earlier, she'd been a university student just trying to figure out what she was going to do with her life. And now she had a great job, she had a perfect little flat, and the man that she loved, Greg, had recently started talking about getting married. Life was perfect. At about 8 p.m., so 2 hours after Jo had gotten to the pub, she wished all her coworkers a happy Christmas. She got up from the table, put on her long cream-colored coat, and headed outside into the snow. It was cold, about 27 degrees Fahrenheit, or almost -3 degrees Celsius, but Jo was used to the winter weather. She pulled her coat collar up around her neck and started walking home to her flat, which was about a 30-minute walk away. After walking for a while, Jo ducked into a convenience store to grab a frozen pizza, and then after that, she went into a small shop called Bargain Booze and bought 2 bottles of cider. And so now, with her food and drinks in hand, Jo continued the walk home. She knew her flat would feel empty without Greg there, but she was still looking forward to spending a relaxing Friday night with her cider and her pizza, and of course, her cat. A little after 8:45 p.m., Jo finally approached her flat, which was a basement unit in an old stone house. Jo and Greg's landlord, a retired English teacher, lived in the unit right above them. Jo unlocked the outside door that led directly into her flat, and then she walked inside and put her food and drinks on the kitchen counter. She took off her coat and hung it on a hook near the door, slipped off her boots, and then called for her cat. But after calling for him, she didn't hear him clacking across the hardwood floor like she expected. She looked all around the flat, but she couldn't find him anywhere. Jo shook her head and went back to the kitchen. Her and Greg's cat was a bit of an escape artist. He frequently got out. Their landlord had found their cat in his place upstairs several times, and also, the cat had even made it across the small front garden to their next-door neighbor's place before. And so Jo felt confident the cat would come home when it got too cold, and so for now, she just grabbed a cider, cracked it open, and sat down in the front room. And after she'd only taken a couple of sips, she heard a knock on the door. Jo hoped it was her landlord returning her cat, so she got out of her chair, opened the door, and when she saw who was there, she gave a huge smile. On the night of December 19th, so 2 days after Jo had met her coworkers at the pub, her boyfriend Greg got back to their flat after being gone for the weekend. He unlocked the flat door, walked inside, and put his bag down on the floor. He was about to call out for Jo, but he heard a strange sound coming from the kitchen. His and Jo's cat was meowing, but it sounded like the animal was afraid or angry. Greg walked into the kitchen, and he saw the cat pacing back and forth in front of an empty food bowl. This was really strange, because Jo always made sure that bowl was full. And so Greg scooped some cat food out of the bag, dumped it in the cat's bowl, and then walked to the bedroom looking for Jo. However, she wasn't there. Greg figured she must have gone out with friends or something. He had messaged her when he was heading home, and he hadn't heard back yet, but he really hadn't thought much about it. However, when he stepped back into the front room, he actually looked around for the first time, and at this point, he did start to get worried. Greg saw Jo's coat, her boots, and her purse right there in the room. He knew how cold it was, and so Jo would never have left, at least not without her coat, and she definitely would not leave her purse behind. Greg grabbed his phone and called Jo, and as he did, he suddenly felt a chill come over him because he heard the sound of her phone ringing inside of her coat pocket right in front of him. Now, Greg started to panic. Jo was one of those people who never went anywhere without her phone. And so he immediately dialed 999, the emergency number in the UK, and he told the operator that his girlfriend, Jo Yates, was missing. In the early morning of December 20th, about 4 hours after Greg called 999, Detective Inspector Joe Goff of the Avon and Somerset Police walked into the flat. D.I. Goff had been a police officer for over 20 years, and as such, he'd learned to remain even-keeled in almost every situation. He spoke in a soft, low voice, and the look on his face almost never gave anything away. Goff greeted a few uniformed officers who had arrived before him and walked over to Greg, who was standing in the front room looking frightened. The detective understood why Greg might be upset, but he didn't want to jump to any conclusions. Now, it was clear Greg's girlfriend had not been home when Greg got there, but besides that, the police didn't have a whole lot of information about what was even going on here. And so Goff introduced himself to Greg and asked him when was the last time he spoke to his girlfriend. Greg said that he had seen Jo a couple days earlier before he left town, but he hadn't talked to her since. Goff asked if it was odd that he would go 2 full days without speaking to his girlfriend. But Greg just shook his head and said no. He'd been busy while he was gone, and he figured Jo had been busy too, getting ready for Christmas, so that's why he must have missed her when he'd called. While Goff listened to Greg, he scanned the room. He could see Jo's coat, boots, and purse. Just like Greg, he did think it was strange that Jo would go out and leave all of those things behind. But still, this didn't prove a crime had occurred here. Goff also noticed 2 cider bottles sitting on a small table. One had a couple of sips gone, and the other looked untouched. Goff asked Greg if there was anything about Jo, like physical attributes or places she liked to frequent, that might point police in the right direction as they began this search for her. Greg gave a basic description of Jo. He said she was average height, had short blonde hair, and blue eyes. And he said she'd been hanging out with coworkers the night he left town at a pub called the Bristol Ram. Goff jotted all of this down in his notebook, got details of where Greg had spent the weekend, and then joined a couple of officers in the kitchen. After spending a few hours in the flat, Goff and the other officers had not found anything that stood out to them. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of a struggle, and at least according to Greg, the front door had been locked when he got home. Goff told his team to speak to the landlord who lived upstairs, and also to Jo's other neighbors, to see if anyone had seen her in the last couple of days. For now, Goff was treating this as a missing persons case that he hoped would have a clear explanation and a happy ending. For all he knew, Jo had just left town without telling her boyfriend. Maybe she was with the person she'd gotten one of those ciders for. And maybe she took a different coat and purse with her and accidentally forgot her phone. I mean, it was just a thought, but either way, Goff felt confident he could retrace Jo's steps from the moment she left the pub and he could find her. Later that day, Goff sat at the station poring over CCTV surveillance footage from locations between the Bristol Ram pub and Jo's flat. Britain has more surveillance cameras per person than almost any other country in the world. This is why Goff felt so confident he'd be able to see exactly where Jo had gone on the last night anybody had heard from her. And he would be right. Using footage from storefront and street cameras, Goff followed Jo's walk out of the pub and through Bristol. Footage from inside the convenience store showed her buying the pizza, and he saw her go into Bargain Booze and walk out with 2 bottles of cider. Goff later picked her up on a street camera in her neighborhood that showed her walking towards her flat. So, it looked like Jo had just gone home after going to the pub, and Goff could see she was wearing the coat and carrying the purse that had been found inside of her flat. However, Goff couldn't find any surveillance footage that showed Jo back on the street after she had gotten home. It was like she had gone inside of her flat and then just vanished. And when the entire day went by without any of Jo's friends or family hearing from her, Goff began to think that Jo very likely did not just ditch her boyfriend and leave town. And so Goff went to meet with Jo's parents, and when he did, he suggested they reach out to the press for some help. On December 21st, 2 days after Greg had reported Jo missing, Joe's parents went on the local news. They said they loved their daughter dearly, and they asked anyone who might have helpful information to please come forward. By the following day, Joe's story had hit the major newspapers in London, and her picture was being shown on TV news programs all throughout the United Kingdom. And soon, the story of the pretty young missing woman had become a public obsession. At 9 a.m. on Christmas morning, so over a week after Joe had gone missing, a couple was walking their dog down a snow-covered street that was about 3 miles away from Joe's flat. All of a sudden, the dog stopped, sniffed the air, and then looked over to the side of the road. The couple glanced in the direction the dog was staring, but all they could see was a stone wall standing several feet high that separated the road they were on from a field filled with trees on the other side. The man tugged on his dog's leash to try to get the dog moving, but his wife told him to actually stop, and then she walked over to the wall and knelt down to see what was there. And when she looked, she saw something bright buried beneath the snow in a pile of leaves. And as she leaned in closer, she screamed. A few minutes later, several police cars came to a stop on the road where the couple and the dog were waiting. Goff got out of his car and walked right past the couple towards that wall. On the ground, he could see part of a brightly colored t-shirt and a frozen blue human arm. Goff put on his gloves, and he was quickly joined by several forensics officers. And together, they carefully dug into the snow and leaves until they revealed the frozen dead body of a young woman. As soon as he saw her, Goff closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He really was almost always unflappable, but seeing something like this, on Christmas of all days, just shattered him. Goff walked away from the body, collected himself, and then he called Joe's parents to tell them he believed he had just found their daughter's body. Later that morning, after the body had been positively identified as Joe's, Goff and several forensics officers stood by the wall, staring down at Joe. Goff wondered if maybe this was just a terrible accident. Maybe Joe had left her flat in a rush without her coat on, slipped on the snowy ground, and suffered some sort of injury that killed her, or that immobilized her and then she died of exposure. And because it had been snowing, her body would have quickly been covered and would have gone unnoticed. As Goff crouched down and searched the area around Joe's body, a few pieces of evidence jumped out at him. Joe was clothed, however, her shirt had been pulled up around her neck, exposing one of her breasts. He also saw bruising on her throat. And so right away, this did not seem like something that would happen from a fall. It looked like something that would happen in a sexual assault. Also, Goff noticed that Joe had on only one sock, but more specifically, he saw the bottom of her bare foot and the bottom of the sock on the other foot were totally clean. There was no dirt, no leaves, or any other sign that she'd been walking around in this area. It was like she'd been dropped here. Goff heard somebody call his name, and he turned to see a forensic biologist crouched down looking at the wall nearby, gesturing to him. Goff joined her, and she immediately pointed to a section of the wall. Goff looked, and he saw there were bloodstains running vertically up this one section of the wall, almost from the very top to the bottom. He looked at the forensic biologist, a bit confused. She told him that these stains were not the kind of blood spatter that would occur from an attack. Instead, these were stains that would have been left when someone tried to lift Joe's bloody body over the wall and failed. Goff stood up and peered over the wall. On the other side was just a big field full of trees. Had someone been able to actually dump Joe's body onto the other side of the wall, meaning had they not failed to get her over, there was no telling how long it would have taken for someone to finally find her. Goff exhaled, and he could see his breath hanging in the air. The way Joe's body had been found, and the bloodstain on the wall, made it pretty clear this was no accident. He now had a murder investigation on his hands. Goff also felt sure that Joe had not been walking along this road when she died. So his first thought was that she had been murdered somewhere else, probably near her flat, and then driven and dumped here. Goff knew the forensics team had a lot of work to do. However, they seemed very optimistic that the snow and the low temperatures had helped preserve the body, and so they hoped they'd be able to find blood or other DNA samples that might lead them to Joe's killer. So Goff left them to it, got in his car, and headed back to the station. Now that he was investigating a murder, he knew where he had to start, with Joe's boyfriend, Greg. That night, so Christmas night, Goff sat across from Greg inside of an interview room, and the young man looked like a total wreck. He told Goff this was supposed to be the first Christmas he and Joe were going to spend together, and he couldn't believe this was happening. However, as upset as Greg was, he was very cooperative throughout the interview. He gave Goff all the details of his weekend trip again, he again told the story of what had happened when he first came home, and he agreed to submit DNA samples. After that, Goff let Greg go. Since Greg was the victim's boyfriend, the detective would not completely cross him off the suspect list. However, Goff had already followed up on Greg's alibi after they met that first time, and it had checked out. Also, because there was no surveillance footage of Joe after she had gone inside of her flat and then disappeared, Goff believed the only person who could have carried out this murder would be somebody who lived basically inside of that building that the flat was in, because that's the only way they would escape being seen on camera going in and out of her place. And because this case was now all over the news, lots of other people in the United Kingdom were beginning to speculate the same thing. The killer must have been inside of that building when Joe went into her flat. But before Goff could even decide what to do about this theory, he got a phone call. On the other end of the line, he heard the sound of an older man's voice who was speaking with a very proper, posh English accent, and this man quickly introduced himself as Chris Jeffries, Joe and Greg's landlord and upstairs neighbor. And Chris told Goff that he had seen the news about the discovery of Joe's body, and he believed he had information that would help. He said on the night Joe went missing, he had seen a few people he did not recognize walking along the side of the house. In the days following this phone call, Goff followed up on the details of Chris's story, and the detective got the feeling that the landlord was not telling him the whole truth. The landlord, Chris, had been aware of the investigation since the moment police showed up after the 999 call. In fact, members of Goff's investigative team had taken a statement from Chris because he owned the building Joe lived in and was her upstairs neighbor. Now it struck Goff that during that initial meeting, Chris had not mentioned these strangers he'd supposedly seen near the house. Chris had also told investigators that on the night Joe went missing, he said he'd spent the entire night at home. However, since that initial conversation, Goff had reviewed additional surveillance footage. And late on the night of December 17th, the last night anyone had seen Joe alive, Goff saw a car on that footage that looked a lot like Chris's car driving across a nearby suspension bridge, indicating he had not been home the whole time. So, on December 30th, 5 days after Joe's body was discovered, Goff met Chris at the police station and escorted him directly to an interview room. Chris had long white hair, and he wore a sports coat and carried this small leather satchel. He sort of looked like an eccentric professor. Goff sat down at a small table across from Chris and asked him how his relationship with Joe had been. Did he have any issues with her? But Chris just shook his head. He said Joe and Greg were a nice couple and good tenants. He said the worst he could say about them was that sometimes their cat got out and found its way upstairs to his place. Goff asked Chris what he'd been doing on the night of December 17th, the night that Joe went missing. Chris immediately looked confused. He said he'd been home the whole night and hadn't seen anything unusual, just like he'd already told police. Now, Goff didn't raise his voice or even change his facial expression, but he said to Chris, "Hey, that's not true." Chris had called and said on the phone that he had noticed some unusual strangers walking by the house. And so he asked Chris, why hadn't he told the police about those people when they first spoke to him? Now, a worried look came across Chris's face. He said he had only come here to help, but now it felt like he was being accused of something. But Goff just asked him again, why hadn't he told the police about the people he saw by the house? Chris kind of shook it off. He said it was the holidays and people in the neighborhood were having parties, so it didn't seem strange to him at the time that people were walking by the house. For a minute, there was just silence between the two men. And then Goff finally said, on December 17th, surveillance cameras had caught a car that looked just like Chris's car driving across the suspension bridge that was the main route between Joe's flat and the location where her body was found. Chris looked totally stunned. He said there had to be a mistake. He never left his flat that night. It was too dangerous, it was snowing and the roads were bad, so he didn't want to leave his house. At this point, Goff just excused himself and walked out of the room. In all honesty, he really didn't know if Chris was guilty. Chris had easy access to Joe's flat, and that car on the surveillance footage could possibly be his. This was just too much to ignore, and so Goff needed a bit more time to fully dig into Chris's background and his seemingly flimsy alibi. Under British law, in the case of serious crimes like murder, police can apply to a magistrate to hold potential suspects for 36 hours without charging them. Goff felt confident a magistrate would allow him to hold Chris. And Goff was right. That night, police arrested Chris, took a DNA sample, and transferred him to a jail cell in a nearby facility. And for the first time, Goff felt like he had a legitimate suspect. The following morning, which was New Year's Eve, Goff sat at his desk staring at the front pages of multiple tabloid newspapers. Goff was very annoyed, because despite all of his team's efforts to hide it, news about Chris's arrest had gotten out. Goff flipped open one of the papers, and as soon as he did, he got even more upset. The paper had basically decided that Chris had murdered Joe. It was not just that he was arrested, but no, he was the killer. And their proof? Well, just how he looked and how he spoke. However, as upset as Goff was about this, the tabloid headlines actually ended up benefiting his investigation. Because that morning, while Goff waited to secure a search warrant for Chris's flat, he got a phone call. This caller said his name was Vincent Tabak, and he lived in the building right next to Joe's that also happened to be owned by Chris. Vincent said he had seen Chris's car earlier that night facing one direction, and the following morning, Chris's car was facing the opposite direction. When Goff heard this, he started to get excited. If he could prove Chris was lying about staying home on the night Joe went missing, he might be able to definitively link Chris's car to the one he'd seen on the suspension bridge in the surveillance footage. After Goff hung up, he immediately asked a detective on his team to follow up with Vincent to see if he might have seen or heard anything else that night. And then soon after that, Goff got the approval for his search warrant, and so he and his team headed over to Chris's upstairs flat. It was New Year's Eve, and as Goff drove across town, he believed he might actually be able to close this case before people all across the country popped open champagne bottles and welcomed in 2011. When Goff and his team walked inside of Chris's upstairs flat, it felt like they'd stepped into a library. The walls were lined with shelves that were overflowing with old books. Goff told his team to split up and begin their search, and it didn't take long before one of them called out from the kitchen. And so Goff and the other officers walked into the kitchen, and they found that officer sitting on the floor holding something that he'd found tucked under one of the kitchen cabinets. When Goff bent down to get a better look, he thought he was looking at the smoking gun that would wrap this case up, because the officer on the floor was holding a pair of trainers, the British word for tennis shoes, and one of these trainers looked like it was stained with blood. Even the normally calm and collected Goff could not hide his excitement. Between this shoe, the call from the next-door neighbor, and the surveillance footage from the bridge, Goff felt like he was close to having enough evidence to build a strong case against Chris. And so officers bagged the trainer and had it sent off to the crime lab for expedited testing. And by the following day, which was New Year's Day of 2011, the lab came back with the test results. And on the same day, the lab also reported that they had run tests on DNA samples they'd found on Joe's clothes and skin. And when all these test results came in, Goff knew that they had found Joe's killer. Based on DNA evidence, surveillance footage, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is what police believe happened to Joe Yates on the night of December 17, 2010. Around 8:45 p.m., the killer stood outside of Joe's front door holding her cat. The killer clutched the cat close to their chest so it wouldn't dart off, and then knocked on Joe's door. Joe opened the door, saw the cat, and immediately smiled. She apologized for the cat's behavior and thanked the killer for bringing her cat back. The killer said it was no problem, leaned in through her door and put the cat down, and as the cat trotted off towards Joe's kitchen, the killer lunged at Joe, pushed her further into the front room, and slammed the door behind them. Joe screamed, but the killer immediately covered her mouth while they shoved her through the flat towards the bedroom. Joe tried to fight back, but it was happening so quickly, and the killer threw her onto the bed, pulled her shirt up around her neck, and grabbed at her chest. Joe struggled, and one of her socks fell off in the fight. The killer tried to keep her pinned down, but Joe let out this loud scream, desperately hoping somebody would hear her and save her. The killer panicked and punched her in the face. Blood ran down Joe's cheeks. Then the killer just wrapped their hands around Joe's throat and squeezed. They sat on top of Joe, strangling her violently for over 20 seconds until Joe stopped breathing and died. The killer got off the bed and walked to the front room. They could hear the cat walking around in the kitchen, but other than that, there wasn't any noise coming from the outside. The killer took a steadying breath, hoping they had somehow managed to keep Joe quiet enough to not get detected. And so the killer just sort of stood there for a long time, listening and planning their next move. About an hour after the killer had arrived at Joe's, they went back into the bedroom, picked up Joe, and carried her to the front door. With Joe in their arms, the killer opened the door, quickly locked it from the inside, then they stepped outside and closed the door behind them. Then they rushed to their car, opened up the trunk, and dropped Joe's body inside. Then the killer got in their car and sped across town in the snow. When they reached a dark, empty road with a wall running alongside it, they pulled over and got out. They scanned the street and saw nobody was nearby, so they carefully opened up the trunk, picked Joe up, and carried her over to the side of the road near the wall. The killer tried to lift Joe's body over the wall, but they just couldn't do it. She was too heavy. And so her body slid down the wall, leaving bloodstains on the wall from her face and neck. Finally, the killer just dropped Joe onto the snowy ground. They piled more snow and leaves on top of her, and then ran back to their car and drove off. A few minutes later, they stepped back inside of their flat, hoping nobody had seen what they just did. Despite what some people in the media had already decided, Joe's landlord, Chris Jeffries, had nothing to do with Joe's murder. It would turn out Joe's next-door neighbor, Vincent Tabak, had killed her. Vincent was the one who had called police to say he believed that Chris, who also happened to be his landlord, had driven off in his car on the night Joe was killed, that he was lying about being in his flat the whole time. Vincent had called police after reading about Chris's arrest in the tabloid newspapers. He thought it was a great opportunity to distance himself from the crime and solidify the police's belief that Chris was the killer. Now, when Goff spoke to Vincent, he learned that Vincent was in the Netherlands celebrating Christmas, meaning he was not home. Now, this didn't mean he was guilty, but it struck Goff as just a little bit suspicious, and so he wanted to follow up with Vincent. So Goff contacted authorities in the Netherlands, and then Goff sent a detective from his team out to the Netherlands to meet with Vincent in person. Now, the interview itself did not provide any new information. However, the detective was able to get Vincent to submit a DNA sample. When the test results for the trainers that had been found in Chris's flat came in from the crime lab, it would turn out that even though there might have been blood on them, there was no connection to the murder at all. However, the DNA samples taken from Joe's body and clothes that the crime lab had just tested as well did match the sample that Vincent had provided. After these results, Goff went back to the surveillance footage of the suspension bridge that was near the road where Joe's body had been found. The car in that footage was not Chris's after all, and police would soon discover that Vincent had taken a different, less direct route to the road, which is why he was never seen on camera. Goff secured a warrant, and he and his team searched Vincent's apartment. While they didn't find any specific evidence pertaining to the crime there, Vincent had been watching violent pornography on his computer, most of which featured men assaulting women and strangling them. After police arrested Vincent, they would learn that he didn't really have any real relationship with Jo. He had just seen her around the neighborhood and thought she was pretty. He had also brought her cat back to her in the past. But over time, Vincent developed a violent obsession with Jo. He wanted to have sex with her and strangle her. And as Christmas of 2010 approached, Vincent decided he didn't want to wait any longer to act on this obsession. And when he saw Jo's cat outside on December 17th, he saw his opportunity. Vincent showed up at Jo's flat, returned her cat, and then killed her. Vincent was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 20 years. As for Jo's landlord, Chris Jeffries, who was all but proclaimed guilty in much of the UK media, he's spoken at length in interviews, telling his side of the story and saying how all he had wanted to do was help the police solve a horrible crime. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. In 1909, Ioana Constantinescu was a 27-year-old woman living in the Romanian city of Timișoara. Ioana was a devout practitioner of Zoroastrianism, which is one of the world's oldest organized religions that began in ancient Persia and is now practiced primarily in East Asia. In the city that Ioana was living in, it was majority Christian, and they looked at Zoroastrians as witches. As such, Ioana was persecuted and ostracized primarily by these two Christian ministers that spread a rumor that she was drinking the blood of local children and that she worshipped Satan. That rumor would spread and grow to the point where everybody knew Ioana as like the singular witch of all the Zoroastrians in the city, and it ultimately incited this angry Christian mob to storm her house on October 21st, 1909, and rip her into the streets and savagely beat her to within an inch of her life. She would survive this lynching, and she would be taken to a hospital where she'd be treated for severe blunt force injuries and lacerations. But after 2 days of being in the hospital, when she had not made a full recovery at all, she checked herself out and headed home. The next day, Ioana was found dead in her apartment, and her family and friends initially believed that she had died as a result of the injuries she had sustained from the angry mob, and that perhaps she had checked herself out of the hospital too soon, and untreated, that's why she must have passed away early. But when the authorities arrived at her house and began looking at the scene, it did not look like she had died as a result of those injuries. It looked more like some sort of ritual suicide. She was laying on this sofa with her arms over her chest. Next to the sofa was an altar that was adorned with strange occult symbols and ritual herbs and effigies, and on the altar was this goblet with deep, dark red stains on the inside. When they looked at Ioana, even though she was fully dressed, underneath her sleeves were all these cuts on her arms, and there were cuts on her legs as well. After her autopsy, the medical examiner said she had died from a combination of blood loss and internal shock from ingesting massive quantities of blood that triggered cardiac arrest. Ioana had been draining her own blood into the sacramental goblet, drinking it, and then doing it over and over again until she died. Locals believed that that was not just a ritual suicide, but rather she was placing a curse on her enemies. Almost immediately following her death, those two Christian ministers that had spread those rumors about her that led to the mob coming and attacking her, they both died of an extremely rare blood-borne illness. And then immediately following their demise, the two primary vigilantes that actually organized that mob that would attack Ioana, they both died. One was hit by a falling tree and another died in a fire. And according to more recent accounts, Ioana's curse didn't end with the death of her tormentors. There have been dozens of reports of people after seeing an image, which is of Ioana after she was discovered by authorities in her home, that they will have bouts of extreme sleep paralysis. These are people that have never had sleep paralysis before, that this picture somehow induces sleep paralysis in them, like they're cursed by Loana. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Witching Hour. Just before midnight on August 22nd, 2005, 38-year-old Rick Eck knocked on the front door of an apartment in the tiny Midwestern farm town of Claremont, Illinois. As Rick waited for the door to open, he could barely stand still because he was so excited about what he was going to be doing that night. Finally, the door swung open, and Rick saw right in front of him this very skinny and gaunt-looking woman with dark hair and dark eyes staring back at him. Her name was Irenia Kottner, and she was 34 years old, and by day, she worked at Walmart, but at night, she became the real version of herself. She was a witch who actually led a group of witches known as a coven that Rick was a part of. Without saying anything, Irenia motioned for Rick to follow her into her apartment, and then Irenia turned and began walking away. And Rick, before stepping over the threshold, he paused for a moment and just turned to the guy he had brought with him, a tall, muscular man named David Lindner, and Rick, he just kind of nodded at David, and David nodded back, and then the two of them walked inside. As Rick and David followed Irenia into her apartment, Rick still could barely contain his excitement. He had only joined this coven recently, about a year and a half ago, and so witchcraft, which is something they were going to be doing that night, was kind of new to him, but it was very exciting. Rick had been inspired to become a witch and join this coven after watching the Harry Potter movies, and so he was hopeful that tonight would go something like Harry Potter. And Rick knew David, the guy he had brought along, was this very powerful warlock, which is a male witch, and so he figured, if David's here, this is bound to go to plan. Rick just hoped he'd be able to keep up with David, or at least play some sort of meaningful support role. Irenia eventually led Rick and David down this dark hallway to this small living room where in the middle of the floor was a ring of lit candles. And as soon as Rick and David stepped into the room with Irenia, they were hit with this powerful smell of incense that had been burning in the room, and also there was all this smoke hovering in the air from the various things that Irenia had been burning in preparation for tonight's event. Rick, David, and Irenia walked quietly into the middle of this circle of candles, and they sat down cross-legged in a circle facing each other, and then they got ready to begin. Life in the town of Claremont was normally very quiet and peaceful. This is a town that literally has more cornfields than people, and Claremont was over 100 miles away from the nearest city. But beneath the calm exterior, Claremont had a dark side. Amongst the 200 or so residents of Claremont were several very dark witches. Not this coven, not Irenia, Rick, and David. They were the good guys. The dark witches, they were kind of out and about in this town and doing bad things, like practicing evil magic and evil witchcraft. And so this coven, led by Irenia, was actually in place to try to combat these evil witches in their midst. And tonight, Rick, David, and Irenia were going to attempt to perform their most ambitious and important magic yet. The coven was going to attempt to break a powerful hex, which is kind of like a curse. And this hex was cast by a person who might very well be the worst of all the dark witches in Claremont, a 16-year-old girl named Lindsay Kassinger. As Rick sat cross-legged in the middle of the circle, he found himself staring at the two slightly bigger candles that sat in the dead center of the circle, that were basically right between Rick, David, and Irenia. And David, as he stared at these two candles, he saw etched in each of the candles' bodies were words. On one candle it said Lindsay, and on the other candle it was etched baby. Because it would turn out this very evil dark witch, Lindsay, was pregnant, and so instead of having to combat one dark soul, the coven would have to combat two, because Lindsay and her baby were kind of intertwined. Now, before this night, the Coven had attempted several times to try to break this hex that Lindsay had cast. And the Coven believed initially this hex was actually cast directly at Irenia, because Irenia was suffering from things like depression and anxiety and not finding love. And so, of course, that had to be a product of this curse. And as the Coven had continued to try and fail at breaking this hex, the hex had only become more powerful and begun to spread from Irenia to other witches in this Coven who actually were not present this particular night, including a 20-year-old woman who began complaining of depression and ever-worsening headaches, which of course had to be because of this hex. And so that was why, on this night, the Coven had decided to really beef up their attack on this hex, and so that was why Rick had gone out and brought in David, the experienced warlock from St. Louis, Missouri, who claimed he had broken a hex before, and he could do it again for them. As Rick, Irenia, and Dave all sat in the circle, they looked at each other, and then they began chanting in unison to bring out the dead, to join them in the living room right now. And as they began this chant, Rick found himself intensely staring at those two candles with Lindsay and Baby on them, and as he stared at the flames dancing across the top of them, Rick started to feel like he was kind of drifting off into a trance-like state. And he knew that based on his prior teachings from Irenia, the leader of this Coven, that this must be what it feels like when the spirit world opens up, which means the dead really were coming into the room. And then, as Rick is kind of dealing with this trance-like state, he heard Irenia begin to talk, but it wasn't her normal voice. It was the slow and deep-sounding voice, almost like something had inhabited her body and taken it over and was now speaking through her mouth. And Irenia, in this kind of slow and strange voice, she would tell Rick and David that the curse is still growing. And then she would say something that totally caught Rick by surprise. She said, again in that slow, strange voice, that the hex now was also on Rick and his entire family, and if they didn't break this hex immediately, Rick and his family would all perish. And when Rick heard this, he's still in this trance-like state, but his heart began racing because he didn't know this hex could potentially affect his loved ones, and so this was a really big deal. They needed to end this hex tonight. Rick listened intently as Irenia began to say in this strange voice what their plan was for that night to break this hex. Basically, Rick and David were going to perform a sacred ritual, and Irenia, she began to say to the spirits in the room that Rick and David, they were ready, but they needed help. And so after she said this, she went quiet, and so too did Rick and David, and they're all just sitting there kind of waiting for something to happen. And then after about a minute of just total silence, Irenia began to speak again, still in this strange, slow, bizarre voice, but Rick and David knew now it was a different voice coming out of her. Now Irenia was speaking on behalf of the spirit world that was in the room with them. And Irenia, she would say in this voice, "I grant you 5 demons to help you on your quest to break this hex." And then after saying this, Irenia, she opened her eyes and she looked kind of confused for a moment, and then she kind of got her bearings and she looked at David and Rick and she told them now in her normal voice that they had to perform this sacred ritual before the 2 candles in the middle with Lindsay and Baby etched on them burned out. And so basically, Rick and David, they needed to get this done tonight. Then Irenia handed David a sacred tool that would be used that night in this sacred ritual that David and Rick were going to complete. And then Rick and David, they would stand up to leave, and before they left, Irenia would give them the typical witch send-off, which was, "Blessed be." And then Rick and David, they nodded their heads, they turned and walked out of the apartment, and as soon as they were out into the night, Rick could have sworn he saw dark shadows moving around all over the place. And he knew right then and there that he and David would be safe that night, because clearly the shadows moving around had to be those 5 demons that Irenia had called forth from the spirit world to protect them this night. And so feeling very safe and empowered, Rick and David went straight into Rick's car. Rick turned it on and pulled away from the curb and began heading towards their destination. A few miles away, at the house where the 16-year-old evil witch, Lindsay Cassinger, lived, a 20-year-old Army private named Joshua Bennett was sitting at the kitchen table in Lindsay's house, eating chicken wings and just kind of enjoying his night. Josh didn't know Lindsay very well, but he wasn't at her house to see Lindsay. He was at her house to see his own mother. And Josh and his mother had a lot of catching up to do. She had abandoned him and his father when he was young, and so Josh's dad had raised him, and then when Josh was old enough, he had joined the military, and now he was about to deploy to the Middle East to go to war. But unexpectedly, Josh's father had died, and so Josh had come back to Illinois for the funeral, and it was at the funeral where he saw his mother. She was in attendance as well, and, even though he was upset with his mother for abandoning him, he felt like, I want to reconnect with her. And so he'd gone over and he'd given her a hug, and his mother had been so touched that she had asked Josh to come by her house in Claremont, Illinois, where she lived with her boyfriend, because she really wanted some alone time to actually hear about Josh's life and kind of, get back together again. And so, of course, Josh had said yes, and so here he was at this house in Claremont. Now, Josh had arrived at this house a little bit earlier, and he was surprised to discover that it was not just his mother and her boyfriend living there, but also his mother's boyfriend's son, whose name was Jackie, was also living there, along with his pregnant girlfriend, the evil witch, Lindsay Cassinger. But Josh didn't really mind that there was extra people. It was just maybe a little bit confusing that this was kind of a big roommate situation. But it seemed like Jackie and his girlfriend Lindsay were very nice people, and they quickly went downstairs to the apartment in the basement and kind of just stayed out of the way so Josh and his mother could catch up. And so after Josh finished eating his wings, his mother came into the kitchen, and the two of them chatted for hours, and then finally, at about midnight that night, Josh decided to go to bed, so he said goodnight to his mom, he retreated to the bedroom, and he laid in bed. But he couldn't really sleep right away, because he had a lot going on in his life. I mean, he had just lost his dad a couple of weeks ago, and then at the same time, he had reconnected with his estranged mother, and he's about to deploy to Iraq, to a war zone, and, he felt ready for that, but at the same time, he was kind of apprehensive, it's about to happen, I hope I'll be able to do my job. And so with all these kind of intense thoughts swirling around his head, he just kind of laid there and didn't really expect to sleep anytime soon. But eventually, Josh did fall asleep. However, it felt like he had only been asleep for a couple of minutes when he was abruptly woken up by the sound of barking coming out from the kitchen. Jackie's dog was going crazy. And so Josh grabbed his phone and he checked the time and saw it was 3 a.m. And so instead of going out there and dealing with this dog, he just thought, you know what, it's going to stop eventually. And so Josh grabbed his pillow and he put it over his head and tried to muffle the sounds so he could fall back asleep. But it didn't work. The dog just kept on barking. And then when Josh took the pillow off his head and kind of sat up wondering what he should do about this dog situation, he heard the sound of a man's voice, a stranger's voice, saying, "I bring you forth from the dark." And then after Josh heard this, he heard the sound of a woman screaming, and it sounded like his mom. And so acting on instinct, Josh leapt from his bed, he ran out of the room, and he goes into the kitchen, and he sees the dog is jumping and barking and going mad, and his mom is screaming, and there's this guy grabbing her, kind of grappling with her, who's wearing black gloves and a ski mask, and there's another guy next to him with the same getup. It's absolute chaos. But before Josh could run over and save his mother, suddenly his chest felt like it was on fire, and then he went blind, and his eyes had this burning pain in them, and then he couldn't breathe, and he was stumbling backwards, barely able to stand. Minutes later, Rick, who was one of the witches from the coven, bolted out of the front door of Lindsay's house where all this chaos was happening, and he just took off running across the street directly into a cornfield. And as he ran, he felt this throbbing pain in his leg, and he could feel blood pooling in his shoe. Rick ran until he couldn't run any farther, and then he collapsed onto the ground, and then he began thinking about what an absolute disaster it had been inside of the evil witch's house. Not only had they failed to break the hex cast by Lindsay, but also Rick was concerned that David, his partner, who was still at the house, was dead. And Ricky began looking around wildly, hoping all those demons that were sent to help them from the spirit world, he was hoping they'd be nearby and they'd know what to do. But Rick looked around and there was no one.
So Rick thought for a second, oh my gosh, Lindsay's hex must be stronger than any of us realize. We have to do something now. We have to end this before me and my family get killed too. And so Rick pulled out his phone and he called Irenia, the leader of the coven, to get her advice about what they should do next. But Irenia didn't respond to what Rick was saying the way he expected her to. Instead, she seemed very cold and almost enraged at what he was saying. And then, before Rick could kind of figure out what was going on with Irenia, he heard off in the distance the sound of sirens making their way to the evil witch's house. Over the next few days, police detectives would speak to everyone inside of Irenia's coven, as well as everyone who knew both Irenia and Lindsay. And slowly but surely, the police would put together what actually happened inside of Lindsay, the evil witch's house, in the early morning hours of August 23rd, 2005. At about 3 a.m. on August 23rd, 2005, Rick and David pulled up onto Lindsay's street and they parked their car a little ways away from Lindsay's house. And then after parking, Rick and David donned their ski masks and their gloves. And then after looking at each other and nodding, they hopped out and began walking towards Lindsay's house. Their plan was to sneak in through one of Lindsay's windows and confront Lindsay the evil witch directly and break the hex by performing a sacred ritual. And then after this ritual was over, they had a second ritual they would need to perform that would send Lindsay's evil soul through the gates of hell. And to do that, they needed the help of the 5 demons that had been sent along by Irenia from the spirit world. Now, Rick and David felt like this was a great plan. However, as soon as they got to Lindsay's house and David actually began trying to climb into one of the windows, everything fell apart. First, the dog began to bark inside of Lindsay's house, and that alerted Josh's mother, who came into the kitchen and sees the dog and sees David falling through the window. And Rick, who didn't really know what was happening inside the house, he just climbed through the window after David, and when he stood up in the kitchen, he realized it was too late. They were totally caught. And so Rick, not really knowing what to do, he's seeing all this yelling and chaos happening. He looks over at David, and he sees David grab something from his belt, and he pulls it out. And it was the tool that Irenia had given them when they left her apartment to go carry out this sacred ritual. This tool was part of that sacred ritual. And it was a long, sharp knife. And what they were going to do is stab the evil witch, Lindsay Kassinger, to death with it. That was how they were going to break the hex. And then after they killed Lindsay, they were going to perform this weird ritual with her clothing that would send her soul through the gates of hell. Now, Rick did understand that this was the plan. They were going to murder Lindsay, but perhaps he didn't really know how serious David was about carrying it out, or the fact that David was not really a warlock as much as he was a violent criminal who had bragged to Irenia about previously murdering someone who had cast a separate hex. And so by killing this person, that was how David had broken the hex previously. Also, Rick may not have known that David had been instructed by Irenia to not let anything stand in their way to break this hex, to carry out this sacred ritual on Lindsay. And so Rick just watched as David raised the knife and began stabbing Josh's mother over and over again in the chest while screaming, "I bring you forth from the dark." And it was at this point that Josh, the army private who heard all this happening, came charging out in his underwear into the kitchen, and Rick watched as David went from stabbing Josh's mother to turning and immediately stabbing Josh directly in the chest. And Rick, at this point, he just jumped right in on it and pulled out his pepper spray and sprayed Josh in the eyes. And so that was why Josh felt the burning sensation and then went blind and couldn't breathe and fell to the ground. And so now it is absolutely chaos inside of this kitchen, and the actual target of David and Rick's, Lindsay, the evil witch, she managed to run out of the house and run to a nearby neighbor's house to get help. Meanwhile, the evil witch's boyfriend, Jackie, he comes upstairs carrying a shotgun. And at this point, Josh is on the ground, clearly dying from the stab wound to his chest. His mother as well is struggling on the ground. And David is going totally nuts, saying all these strange things and whipping his knife around. And Rick is just totally panicking and doesn't know what to do. And so when Jackie ran at Rick with this shotgun, Rick pulled out his own knife and attempted to stab Jackie, but somehow missed Jackie and stabbed himself in the leg. And so that was why his leg was throbbing and bleeding, because he had stabbed himself. And then after Rick had stabbed himself, Jackie just walked over and Spartan kicked Rick down the stairs into the basement. And then Jackie turned his attention from Rick to David, who was still just going nuts with this knife and being a total maniac. And Jackie just walked over to David, and David, he sees the shotgun coming over to him, and he tries to move the barrel out of the way, but then somehow only manages to point the gun directly at his own stomach, at which point Jackie just fired a slug directly into David's gut. And it was at this moment, as David is crumpling to the ground with this horrible stomach wound, that the neighbor that Lindsay, the evil witch, had gone to go get, had come to the house. They went inside, and they found a scene of absolute carnage. And before the neighbor could even do anything, Rick, who had stabbed himself in the leg and been kicked down into the basement, had scrambled up the steps and just run right past all the bodies on the ground, past the neighbor who didn't even do anything, outside, and Rick just kept on running out into that cornfield. And so at this point, the neighbor didn't even try to figure out what happened. He just called 911. But it was already too late for Josh, the army private, who was only at this house to reconnect with his estranged mother before he deployed to Iraq. And here he was, dead on the ground from this totally bizarre attack. It would turn out Rick, David, and really the entire coven of witches that fell under Irenia had been totally duped. They all fully believed that Lindsay was in fact an evil witch who had cast this hex on Irenia, which was spreading to all the other members of the coven. But in reality, Irenia, the leader of this coven, she didn't believe there was a hex. That had nothing to do with any of this. The whole coven thing was totally made up. She was just jealous that Lindsay was dating Jackie. Irenia had previously dated Jackie, and they had broken up, and Irenia still wanted to get back together, but Jackie didn't. And so now that Jackie was with Lindsay, Irenia just couldn't handle it. And so, naturally, Irenia had constructed this whole thing about Lindsay being one of the dark witches in Claremont, Illinois, and she's cast this hex, and now you, my witches in this coven, you need to go and kill her. But, of course, Lindsay did not end up getting killed, and instead, it was the totally innocent person, Josh, the army private, who had nothing to do with any of this, who got killed. In addition to Josh dying, David, the warlock from St. Louis, he died from the shotgun blast to his stomach, and then Josh's mother, who had been stabbed repeatedly by David, she would actually survive her attack. Irenia would ultimately be found guilty of first-degree murder, and she would be sentenced to 57 years in prison. Rick pleaded guilty to murder as well, and he was sentenced to 20 years, and a third member of the coven, who was not present for the attack, but who after the fact helped cover it up, they were sentenced to 32 years in prison.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these.